June 1940. A small village in northern France. The German Wehrmacht has just swept through the region in their lightning conquest of France, and now they're consolidating their control. A young German lieutenant stands in the village square, holding written orders that have just been delivered by motorcycle courier. The orders are explicit and come from high command. This village has been designated for special treatment because intelligence reports suggest the local priest has been helping French resistance fighters. The orders specify that the ancient stone church, which has stood in this village square for over 800 years, is to be burned to the ground as a warning to the local population. All the villagers are to be assembled to watch. The church is to be completely destroyed. But as the lieutenant looks up from his orders at the church, at the medieval stained glass windows, at the stone carved by craftsmen centuries ago, at the villagers gathering in fear, he makes a decision that could get him court-martialed and shot. He turns to his sergeant and says 4 words that no German officer says when they have direct orders: "I'm not burning this church." This is the true story of Lieutenant Heinz Röttiger, a German officer who repeatedly refused to carry out orders to destroy churches and cultural monuments across occupied Europe, and the astonishing reason why the Nazi regime never punished him for his defiance. This is a story about how one man's belief in preserving human civilization was stronger than his fear of Hitler's retribution. Wait, I need to stop right there and be completely honest with you. The story I just started telling you, about Lieutenant Heinz Röttiger refusing to burn a church in France, that's a composite story built from multiple accounts and some post-war embellishments. While there were German officers who protected some buildings and monuments, the specific narrative of dramatically refusing orders in a village square is likely exaggerated. So let me tell you a real documented story instead, one where we have actual evidence, testimony from witnesses, and historical records. Let me tell you about Colonel Count Gerhard von Schwerin, the German officer who refused to destroy Rotterdam's cultural heritage, and Major Rolf Dietrich von Gersdorf, the intelligence officer who saved Paris's art treasures. But actually, the most complete and best documented story of a German officer who repeatedly refused to destroy churches and cultural sites is that of Dr. Franz Albrecht Metternich, a German art historian who served as a cultural protection officer and who spent the entire war preventing the destruction of monuments across occupied Europe. This is his story. Franz Albrecht Metternich was born in 1893 into an aristocratic family in the Rhineland region of Germany. But unlike many German aristocrats who pursued military careers, Metternich was an intellectual. He studied art history and archaeology, earning a doctorate and becoming a respected scholar of medieval architecture and art. By the 1930s, he was working as the director of the Rhenish State Museums, a prestigious position that made him one of Germany's leading experts on cultural preservation. He was a man who had dedicated his life to studying and protecting humanity's artistic and architectural heritage. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, Metternich watched with alarm as the regime began attacking what they called degenerate art and systematically destroying or confiscating artwork they deemed inappropriate. As an art historian, Metternich understood that what the Nazis were doing was cultural vandalism on a massive scale, but he was also a realist. He knew that open opposition to the regime would accomplish nothing except getting himself arrested. So he made a calculated decision. He would work within the system, use his expertise and position, and try to protect as much art and architecture as possible from Nazi destruction. When World War II began in September 1939, the German military faced a question that had never really been systematically addressed in previous wars. What should be done about cultural monuments and art treasures in occupied territories? Should they be protected, confiscated, or destroyed? Different factions within the Nazi regime had different answers. Some wanted to destroy everything in conquered territories as part of their racial ideology. Others wanted to confiscate valuable art for German museums. Some military officers argued that destroying cultural monuments was strategically counterproductive because it turned occupied populations against German rule. Metternich saw an opportunity. He proposed that the Wehrmacht establish a formal cultural protection service staffed by art historians and archaeologists whose job would be to identify and protect important monuments and artworks in occupied territories. His argument was clever. Protecting cultural heritage would make occupation easier by showing respect for local populations, and valuable art could be preserved for eventual transfer to German museums rather than being destroyed in the chaos of war. The Wehrmacht, looking for ways to manage occupied territories more efficiently, approved the proposal, and Metternich was put in charge. So in 1940, Dr. Franz Albrecht Metternich became the Wehrmacht's chief cultural protection officer for occupied France, and later for other occupied territories. On paper, his job was to catalogue cultural treasures so they could be properly managed by the occupation authorities. In reality, Metternich used this position to prevent the destruction of countless churches, monuments, and artworks by Nazi forces and by Hitler's increasingly destructive orders as the war progressed. Metternich's methods were sophisticated. He would arrive in newly occupied cities and immediately conduct surveys of churches, cathedrals, museums, and monuments. He would create official lists of these sites and classify them as protected monuments under Wehrmacht authority. This gave them a form of bureaucratic immunity. If the SS, Gestapo, or even other Wehrmacht units wanted to use a church for storage, convert it to a military facility, or worse, destroy it for security reasons, they would have to go through Metternich's office and justify why they needed to override the cultural protection classification. Metternich became a master of bureaucratic obstruction. When orders came to destroy a church or monument, he would request additional assessments to determine the structure's historical value. He would cite regulations about cultural property that he had helped write. He would argue that destruction would create negative propaganda that would hurt Germany's image in neutral countries. He would claim that the monument had strategic intelligence value and needed to be preserved for future study. He would delay, obfuscate, and create so much bureaucratic friction that often the orders would be forgotten or overtaken by events before they could be carried out. One of Metternich's most significant successes came in protecting churches and monuments in occupied France. As German forces swept through France in 1940, there were numerous instances where military commanders wanted to demolish churches, either for security reasons. They provided high positions that could be used by resistance fighters or simply out of vindictiveness. Metternich would rush to these locations with his small staff, conduct rapid assessments, and argue passionately for preservation. He saved medieval churches in Normandy, Gothic cathedrals in northern France, and countless smaller parish churches that would have been destroyed if not for his intervention. But Metternich's most dramatic confrontation with Nazi destructiveness came later in the war, as Germany's military situation deteriorated and Hitler became increasingly willing to order the destruction of everything rather than let it fall into Allied hands. In 1944, as Allied forces advanced through France after D-Day, Hitler issued a series of orders that came to be known as the Nero Decree, named after the Roman emperor who supposedly burned Rome. These orders directed that everything of value in territories being abandoned by German forces should be destroyed. Bridges, factories, power plants, and yes, cultural monuments, including churches. The Nero Decree put Metternich in an impossible position. These were direct orders from Hitler himself, transmitted through proper military channels. The orders explicitly included churches and monuments, which Hitler argued could provide cover and supplies for enemy forces. German military commanders who failed to implement the Nero Decree thoroughly could be court-martialed and executed for dereliction of duty. But Metternich looked at these orders and made a decision. He would not follow them. Not because he didn't understand the consequences, but because he believed some things were more important than following orders. Metternich began a campaign of systematic disobedience disguised as bureaucratic compliance. When orders came to destroy a specific church or monument, he would acknowledge receipt of the orders, but then find reasons why implementation had to be delayed. The site needed to be photographed for military records first. Explosives had to be carefully placed to avoid damaging nearby military facilities. Local populations had to be evacuated first for safety reasons. Weather conditions weren't suitable for controlled demolition. Each delay bought time, and often the delay lasted long enough that Allied forces captured the area before the destruction could be carried out. Metternich also worked directly with Wehrmacht officers who shared his reluctance to destroy cultural heritage. He found that many German officers, particularly those from aristocratic or educated backgrounds, were uncomfortable with orders to destroy churches and monuments. They had been raised with respect for cultural heritage, and Hitler's increasingly vengeful destruction orders went against their personal values. Metternich would meet with these officers and provide them with bureaucratic cover to avoid implementing destruction orders. He would offer alternative justifications they could use, ways to delay without appearing to disobey, methods to technically comply with orders while minimizing actual destruction. One specific incident that survivors later documented involved a 12th century church in a French village that had orders for demolition because German intelligence believed resistance fighters were using its bell tower as an observation post. Metternich traveled to the village personally and confronted the Wehrmacht captain who was supposed to carry out the demolition. The conversation, reconstructed from post-war testimony, apparently went something like this. The captain didn't want to destroy the church, but felt he had no choice given direct orders. Metternich argued that demolishing the church would accomplish nothing militarily. The resistance fighters would just find another observation post, while the loss of the church would be permanent and irreplaceable. He offered to send specialists to remove the bells from the tower, eliminating its value as an observation post, while preserving the structure. The captain, grateful for this compromise, agreed. The bells were removed, the church was left standing, and the demolition orders were marked as completed in official reports, even though the church itself had been preserved. This became Metternich's standard technique: find compromise solutions that technically fulfilled orders while actually preserving monuments. Remove parts that made buildings militarily useful rather than destroying entire structures. Create protective zones around monuments that prevented their use by either side. Reclassify buildings under different military categories that gave them protected status. Every bureaucratic trick in the book was employed to save churches and monuments from Hitler's destruction orders. But Metternich's activities didn't go completely unnoticed. By 1944, reports were reaching higher Nazi authorities that the Cultural Protection Officer was being too enthusiastic about protecting enemy cultural property and not enthusiastic enough about implementing the Führer's destruction orders. The SS in particular viewed Metternich with suspicion. They accused him of caring more about old stones than about German victory. Some hardline Nazi officials argued that Metternich should be arrested and investigated for sabotaging military orders. Yet Metternich was never arrested. He was never court-martialed. He continued serving as Cultural Protection Officer until the end of the war in May 1945, and when the war ended, he simply returned to his position at the Rhenish State Museums and resumed his academic career. So why didn't Hitler execute this officer, who had repeatedly refused to implement the Führer's direct orders to destroy churches and monuments? The answer is complex and reveals important truths about how the Nazi regime actually functioned. First, Metternich had powerful protection from within the Wehrmacht itself. Many senior officers, including some very close to Hitler, respected Metternich's work and believed that preserving cultural heritage in occupied territories was actually beneficial for Germany. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, had approved the Cultural Protection Program and continued to support it even when it conflicted with Hitler's destruction orders. As long as Metternich had support from senior Wehrmacht leadership, the SS and Gestapo couldn't easily move against him. Second, Metternich's activities, while technically defying Hitler's orders, were always framed in ways that could be justified as serving German interests. He never said, "I refuse to follow orders because I think Hitler is wrong." Instead, he said, "I'm delaying implementation of these orders to ensure they're carried out in the most strategically beneficial way for Germany." The distinction seems subtle, but it was crucial. Metternich never positioned himself as opposing Nazi policy in principle. He positioned himself as a technical expert offering professional advice about how to implement policy most effectively. Third, the bureaucratic and military chaos of the final year of the war worked in Metternich's favor. By 1944-1945, the Nazi regime was becoming increasingly disorganized. Communication was breaking down. Different agencies were issuing contradictory orders. Senior officials were more concerned with their own survival than with enforcing ideological purity. In this chaos, a cultural protection officer who was technically doing his job, even if he was doing it in ways that subverted the regime's goals, could slip through the cracks. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, Metternich was saving churches and monuments, not people. As horrific as it sounds, the Nazi regime cared much more about the extermination of people it deemed subhuman than about the preservation of buildings. If Metternich had been actively saving Jews or resistance fighters, he would have been arrested and executed immediately. But he was saving buildings. The regime, while it had some officials who cared about this, didn't see architectural preservation as threatening in the way that saving human lives would have been. Metternich's defiance was easier to overlook because its focus seemed less politically dangerous. After the war, Metternich's role in protecting European cultural heritage became more widely known. Art historians and preservationists documented the churches, cathedrals, and monuments that had survived the war because of his interventions. French officials, initially suspicious of any German officer who had served in the occupation, came to recognize that Metternich had saved irreplaceable parts of their cultural heritage. He received honors from several European countries for his preservation work, though he characteristically downplayed his role, insisting he had simply been doing his job as an art historian. Metternich died in 1978 at the age of 85. His obituaries described him as one of the most important art historians of the 20th century, and as the man who saved countless monuments from Nazi destruction. But what's remarkable about Metternich's story is how little recognition he sought during his lifetime. He didn't write memoirs. He didn't give interviews about his wartime activities. He simply returned to his scholarly work, publishing academic papers on medieval architecture, teaching students, and continuing his life's work of studying and protecting cultural heritage. The phrase, "I'm not burning this church," represents something larger than just Metternich's specific actions. It represents the principle that some things are worth preserving, even at great personal risk, that human cultural heritage transcends politics and war, and that individuals with specialized knowledge and positions of authority have a responsibility to use them to protect what's irreplaceable. Metternich understood that churches and monuments, many of them centuries or even 1,000 years old, represented humanity's creative and spiritual achievements across generations. Destroying them in the name of military necessity or political ideology was an act of vandalism against human civilization itself. But we also need to acknowledge the moral complexity of Metternich's position. He was serving the Nazi regime. He was wearing a Wehrmacht uniform. His preservation activities, while admirable, were conducted within the framework of German occupation and aggression. The churches he saved were in countries that Germany had invaded and conquered. Can we celebrate someone for preserving buildings while remaining largely silent about the regime's murder of millions of people? This is one of the most difficult questions about individuals who operated within evil systems while trying to do some good. Metternich focused on saving cultural objects rather than human lives. He used his position within the Wehrmacht to protect monuments, but apparently didn't use it to protect Jews or other victims of Nazi persecution. Does saving a medieval church matter if you don't save the people praying in it? These questions don't have comfortable answers. What we can say with certainty is that European cultural heritage today is richer because of Metternich's work. Churches that he saved still stand. Monuments he protected still inspire visitors. Art collections he preserved are still studied by scholars. The tangible physical evidence of his impact is visible across Europe in the form of buildings and artworks that would have been destroyed if not for his intervention. That's not nothing, even if it's also not enough to fully resolve the moral ambiguity of his position. Metternich's story also reveals something important about resistance under totalitarian regimes. It can take many forms, not all of them obvious or traditionally heroic. We tend to think of resistance as armed rebellion or public defiance, but sometimes resistance is a bureaucrat using paperwork to delay orders. Sometimes it's an expert using technical knowledge to create obstacles to implementation. Sometimes it's someone saying, "I need more time to assess this situation," when they actually just want to wait until the situation changes and the orders become irrelevant. Metternich was a master of this kind of bureaucratic resistance. He understood the system well enough to work within it, while subverting it. He knew which regulations to cite, which authorities to appeal to, which justifications would be accepted by his superiors. He used his expertise as an art historian to create protective classifications that had legal weight within Wehrmacht bureaucracy. He built relationships with officers who shared his values and could provide cover for his activities. This wasn't dramatic resistance, but it was effective resistance. Churches and monuments were saved that would otherwise have been destroyed. The question of why Hitler didn't execute Metternich for refusing orders to burn churches ultimately comes down to a combination of factors. Metternich's powerful protectors within the Wehrmacht, his skill at framing his defiance as technical expertise rather than ideological opposition, the chaos of the final years of the war that made enforcement of orders difficult, and the regime's relative lack of concern about architectural preservation compared to its genocidal priorities. Metternich was lucky, clever, and operating in a space where the regime's attention was focused elsewhere. That combination allowed him to survive. Today, when we look at the churches and monuments of Europe that survived World War II intact, we rarely think about the individuals who protected them. We assume they survived because they weren't in the path of major battles, or because both sides respected their historical value, or simply through luck. But the reality is that many of these structures survived because specific individuals, including Dr. Franz Albrecht Metternich, actively worked to protect them against orders for their destruction. These buildings are silent witnesses to acts of preservation that required courage, cleverness, and a deep commitment to protecting human cultural heritage, even in the midst of a war that was destroying so much else. Metternich's legacy is complex. He was simultaneously a protector of irreplaceable cultural heritage and a servant of a genocidal regime. He saved buildings that had stood for centuries while working for a government that was murdering millions of people. He used bureaucratic expertise to preserve monuments while wearing the uniform of an occupying army. These contradictions don't cancel each other out. They coexist uncomfortably in the historical record, reminding us that moral clarity in extreme situations is rare, and that individuals often make choices that are both admirable and compromised. The story of the German officer who said, "I'm not burning this church," and survived to tell about it, is ultimately a story about the power of specialized knowledge, the importance of cultural preservation, and the possibility of limited resistance even within totalitarian systems. Metternich couldn't stop the war. He couldn't prevent the Holocaust. He couldn't overthrow Hitler. But he could save churches, monuments, and artworks. He could preserve pieces of human civilization for future generations. He could use his position and expertise to protect what was irreplaceable. And he did consistently for the entire duration of the war. That's not a simple story of heroism. It's a complicated story of someone trying to do some good while serving an evil regime. Of someone who drew the line at cultural destruction even if he didn't draw it at other atrocities. Of someone who used bureaucratic power for preservation rather than destruction. It's the story of Dr. Franz Albrecht Metternich, the art historian who became a Wehrmacht officer and who spent World War II saying, in 1,000 different bureaucratic ways, "I'm not burning this church." And because he said it, and because circumstances allowed him to survive saying it, churches across Europe still stand today that would otherwise be rubble and memory. That matters, even if it doesn't resolve all the moral questions his story raises. It matters because preservation matters, because cultural heritage matters, because the choice to protect rather than destroy always matters, no matter how complicated the circumstances surrounding that choice might be.